There are faces that define an era, and then there are faces that hide one. For 1,000 dazzling days, she was the face of a new American royalty, a whispered promise of grace, intelligence, and glamour. Jacqueline Kennedy. Her image was a masterpiece of control, a carefully curated portrait of wifely devotion and national pride. It was projected onto every television screen, printed in every magazine, and etched into the collective memory of a generation. But portraits, by their very nature, are flat. They show you the surface, the smile, the perfectly coiffed hair. They don't show you the tremor in the hand that's held just out of frame. They don't let you hear the frantic beating of a heart papering over its cracks with poise. We think we know her story. The fairy tale wedding, the White House years dubbed Camelot, the tragic assassination, and the dignified widow who captured the world's sympathy. But what if the greatest drama of her life wasn't the one that played out in public? What if the real story is one of profound, repeated, and soul-crushing betrayal? A story not just of a husband stolen by a bullet, but of a marriage chipped away by infidelity, and a woman who had to perform the role of a lifetime, the adoring wife, while her world was quietly, and then very loudly, falling apart. This is the story of the smile that masked a scream and the first lady who was forced to grieve her husband long before he was ever taken from her. To understand the weight of Jackie's burden, you have to understand the world she was meant to perfect. The early 1960s in America were a paradox of explosive optimism and chilling fear. The Second World War was a fresh, raw memory, but a new kind of conflict, the Cold War, simmered beneath the surface of daily life. Families were building homes in sprawling suburbs, buying shiny new cars, and dreaming of a brighter future. Yet children were also practicing duck and cover drills under their school desks, a constant low-grade hum of anxiety about the atomic bomb. Into this tense, expectant world stepped John F. Kennedy. He was young, handsome, and vibrant. He spoke of a new frontier, of passing the torch to a new generation. He and his beautiful wife, Jacqueline, were more than a president and first lady. They were a national obsession. They were America's answer to the old monarchies of Europe. The White House, under Jackie's meticulous direction, was transformed. It was no longer just the seat of power. It became a cultural hub hosting Nobel laureates, artists, and musicians. It became a stage, and the Kennedys were its stars. This was Camelot, a term Jackie herself would coin in the aftermath of tragedy, borrowing it from a popular Broadway musical. It evoked a mythical, idyllic kingdom, a brief, shining moment of hope and greatness. The media eagerly built this legend. Photographs showed a perfect family, a powerful, doting father, a stylish, devoted mother, and two angelic children, Caroline and John Jr., playing in the Oval Office. They were the embodiment of the American dream, polished to a spectacular sheen. But the very perfection of this image created an impossible standard. Behind the stately columns of the White House, behind the closed doors of the private quarters, the reality of their lives was far more complicated, far more human, and for Jackie far more painful. The stage had been set, the audience was captivated, but the leading lady was living a very different script. Jacqueline Lee Bouvier was born into a world of privilege, but also one of early emotional upheaval. Her father, Blackjack Bouvier, was a handsome, charming stockbroker with a notorious appetite for women and alcohol. Her parents' marriage was a battlefield of infidelity and resentment, culminating in a bitter divorce when Jackie was just 10. From her father, she learned about the magnetic pull of charismatic, yet unreliable men. From her mother, Janet, she learned the vital importance of maintaining appearances, of marrying for security, and of enduring private humiliation with public grace. These were the lessons that would unwittingly become her survival guide. When she met John F. Kennedy, a rising political star from a powerful and ambitious clan, the parallels must have been striking. Like her father, Jack was impossibly charming, intelligent, and desired by everyone. And like her father, his fidelity was complicated. Friends warned her. Her own instincts likely sounded an alarm, but Jack Kennedy wasn't just a man. He was a destiny. Marrying him was an entry into a world of immense power and purpose. Their wedding in 1953 was the social event of the year, a union of two American dynasties. The early years of their marriage were a trial by fire. Jackie suffered a miscarriage and then delivered a stillborn daughter, Arabella. These were private agonies, yet they were compounded by a growing, isolating loneliness. Jack was often absent, consumed by his political career, and as she quickly discovered by other women, his affairs were not discreet whispers. They were a constant humming background noise to their marriage. The Kennedy men were infamous for their philandering, and it was treated almost as an expected, if unfortunate, part of the package. The women were expected to look the other way. For Jackie, this was a familiar, painful dynamic, echoing the betrayals that had shattered her own childhood. She was intelligent, proud, and sensitive. The humiliation must have been immense. Yet, she played her part. She built a wall of aristocratic reserve around her heart. She focused on her duties, on creating a beautiful home, and later on raising her children. But the betrayals kept coming, each one a small crack in the facade of Camelot. Staff in the White House would later speak of the unspoken tension, of the women smuggled in and out of the White House when the First Lady was away. Jackie's friend, the journalist Charles Bartlett, recalled her quiet pain, saying it was a terribly tough life. She was holding on by her fingernails. And then came the one affair that was different, the one that couldn't be dismissed as a fleeting dalliance. This one had a name, a face, and a voice recognized by the entire world: Marilyn Monroe. The affair between the president and the world's most famous movie star wasn't just a betrayal, it was a threat. Marilyn Monroe wasn't a nameless secretary or a society girl who could be quietly dismissed. She was an icon in her own right, a woman whose own myth was as powerful as the Kennedys. She represented everything Jackie was not: overtly sexual, emotionally volatile, and tragically vulnerable. She was the shadow self of the poised, elegant First Lady. The affair, believed to have begun in early 1962, was an open secret in certain circles, but it became terrifyingly real for Jackie. According to multiple biographers, including Christopher Anderson and J. Randy Taraborelli, Marilyn, who was struggling with mental health issues and a dependency on barbiturates, became obsessed. She wasn't content to be a secret. She believed the president loved her and would leave his wife for her. The most chilling story, recounted by those in their inner circle, involves a phone call. Marilyn Monroe, in a haze of pills and champagne, allegedly called the private quarters of the White House and asked to speak to Jacqueline. When she was put through, she supposedly told the First Lady that Jack had promised to marry her. She saw herself as the next First Lady. Most women would have screamed or cried or hung up. Jackie, conditioned by a lifetime of swallowing pain, did none of those things. Her response, as reported by those who heard the story from her, was icy, calm, and utterly devastating. She is said to have replied in her signature soft, breathy voice, "Marilyn, you'll marry Jack, that's great. And you'll move into the White House and you'll assume the responsibilities of First Lady, and I'll move out and you'll have all the problems." In that single quiet sentence, she laid bare the truth. She wasn't just a wife, She was a partner in a massive, complex enterprise. The problems she referred to were not just planning state dinners. They were dealing with the press, the political machinations, the crushing public expectation, and of course, Jack's other women. It was a verbal masterstroke, a cold dose of reality that underlined Marilyn's naivete. But imagine the steel it took to deliver it. Imagine the profound solitude of that moment, defending your marriage from a Hollywood icon, knowing the man you were defending was the cause of your pain. The affair ended not long after. The president, alerted to the danger by his brother Robert, began to distance himself. Marilyn's last desperate public act was her infamous sultry performance of Happy Birthday, Mr. President at Madison Square Garden in May 1962. Jackie tellingly made sure she was not in attendance. Watching it on television, she reportedly turned to a friend and remarked dryly on the performance, but beneath the cool exterior, a friend later said she saw it for what it was, a public display of lust. Less than 3 months later, Marilyn Monroe was dead. For Jackie, it must have been a haunting, complicated end to a chapter of deep personal humiliation. The betrayal had been silenced, but the scar remained. It was a prelude, a grim foreshadowing of a much greater, more public loss that was yet to come. The morning of November 22nd, 1963, dawned bright and sunny in Texas. For Jackie, it was the culmination of a grueling political trip. She hadn't wanted to go. The political climate in Dallas was toxic, virulently anti-Kennedy. But her husband had asked her to, and her presence was a political asset. He had turned to her on the trip and said, "You're so beautiful. Everyone in Texas is crazy about you." He was proud of her, and for a moment, perhaps the facade and the reality were one and the same. She chose her outfit with care, a flamingo pink, raspberry-trimmed wool suit. It was a Chanel design, a favorite of hers, bright and optimistic. It was the perfect costume for the role she was playing that day, the radiant First Lady. As the presidential limousine, an open-top convertible, made its way through the cheering crowds in Dealey Plaza, she was seated to the president's left. She was smiling, waving, the picture of composure. What happened next is seared into history, but for Jackie it was not history. It was a visceral, personal nightmare that unfolded in a matter of seconds. First, a sound like a firecracker. She saw her husband's hands fly to his throat. He turned to her, a quizzical, confused look on his face. She thought he was joking, perhaps. Then, the second shot, the one that was unmistakable, the one that shattered the world. In her later testimony to the Warren Commission, she described it with harrowing clarity. "I saw his head go back. It was like a watermelon splitting open." In that instant, every protocol, every lesson in public decorum was annihilated by pure animal instinct. She wasn't the first lady anymore. She was a wife watching her husband die in her lap. The world remembers the Zapruder film, a silent, grainy horror show. But inside the car, it was a scene of chaos and blood. She remembered crying out, "Oh my God, they have shot my husband. I love you, Jack." As the car sped towards Parkland Hospital, she cradled his ruined head, her pink suit and white gloves soaked in his blood and brain matter. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who had heroically leapt onto the back of the moving car, would later describe the scene with choked emotion, recalling how she refused to let go of a piece of her husband's skull she had picked up from the trunk, as if by holding it, she could somehow put him back together. At the hospital, they tried to lead her away, but she refused. She stood guard outside the trauma room, a stoic, blood-soaked sentinel. When a priest was called, she insisted on being there, giving her husband her own wedding ring to hold. When he was pronounced dead, her world and the world of Camelot officially ended. The hours that followed are a testament to a strength that is almost beyond comprehension. On the flight back to Washington aboard Air Force One, they asked her if she wanted to change out of her stained pink suit before Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as the new president. Her response was one of the most powerful and revealing statements she ever made. "No," she said firmly. "Let them see what they've done." In that moment of supreme agony, a new Jackie was born. The woman who had spent years silently enduring private betrayals now refused to hide the evidence of this ultimate public one. She would force the world to look at the gruesome reality. The pink suit, once a symbol of manufactured glamour, became a sacred, horrific relic. It was a declaration. "You built the myth with me," she seemed to say. "Now you will witness its brutal destruction." She wore that suit all the way back to the White House, a walking embodiment of a nation's fresh, gaping wound. The smile was finally gone, replaced by a mask of shock and grief so profound it commanded the world's attention more than any smile ever had. The performance was over. The pain was now the show. In the immediate aftermath, Jackie Kennedy's private grief became a public spectacle. The world watched breathless as this 34-year-old widow navigated an unimaginable landscape of sorrow. But what they saw was not a broken woman. They saw a figure of almost Roman stoicism and resolve. It was she who planned the funeral, modeling it after Abraham Lincoln's, consciously and deliberately shaping the final act of her husband's story. She stood for hours in the Capitol Rotunda, her face veiled in black, receiving the condolences of world leaders. She walked in the funeral procession behind his horse-drawn caisson, holding her children's hands, a portrait of tragic dignity that brought a grieving nation to its knees. This was her greatest performance, but this time the purpose was different. It was no longer about masking betrayal, but about defining a legacy. Just a week after the assassination, she summoned the journalist Theodore H. White to the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport. It was there, in an interview that would define a presidency for decades to come, that she single-handedly created the myth of Camelot. She told White, "There'll be great presidents again, but there'll never be another Camelot." She knew that history is a raw, messy thing, but memory is malleable. She crafted an image of a golden age, a brief, shining moment of grace and greatness, deliberately editing out the painful realities of her own marriage and the political complexities of his presidency. It was an act of profound loyalty to the man who had so often been disloyal to her. In death, she gave him the uncomplicated perfection he never had in life. It was her final and perhaps most significant act as First Lady. But behind this public image of the stoic widow, there was a woman grappling with immense trauma and a simmering righteous anger. In her oral history interviews, recorded just months after the assassination but sealed for nearly 50 years, a different Jackie emerges. Her voice is raw, her opinion sharp. She rails against the men she felt had failed her husband, and she speaks with a candor that would have been shocking at the time. She called Martin Luther King Jr. a phony for his alleged indiscretions, a bitter irony given her own husband's behavior. She expressed disdain for politicians like Charles de Gaulle and Indira Gandhi. It was the sound of a woman unburdened finally from the duty to be pleasant. Her life continued to be defined by the fear of another betrayal, another loss. The assassination of her brother-in-law, Robert F. Kennedy, in 1968 was the final straw. She felt the Kennedy name was cursed, that America was a place of violence that would hunt down her and her children. Her subsequent marriage to the Greek shipping tycoon Aristotle Onassis shocked and confused the world. People called her a traitor to the Kennedy memory, a gold digger. But for her, it was an act of self-preservation. Onassis was fabulously wealthy and powerful. He had his own private island and his own army. She told friends, "If they're killing Kennedys, then my children are targets. I want to get out of this country." The marriage was not a romance, it was an escape. It was her desperate attempt to buy safety, to build a fortress around herself and her children that no bullet and no prying public could penetrate. It was the act of a woman who had been betrayed by a nation and was now turning her back on it. The story of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis is often framed as a tragedy, but to see it only as that is to miss the point. It is more profoundly a story of survival. It's a story about the immense chasm between our public personas and our private realities. Was her marriage to Jack Kennedy a lie? Not entirely. There is ample evidence of genuine affection, intellectual connection, and a deep, if complicated, bond. But it was a marriage built on a precarious foundation, one that forced her to develop an almost superhuman level of emotional control. The controversy of her life is the controversy of her choices. Was her stoicism a sign of strength or a form of self-denial? Was her creation of the Camelot myth a beautiful tribute or a historical whitewash? Was her marriage to Onassis a pragmatic move for security or a betrayal of a sacred memory? The truth is, it was likely all of these things at once. History is rarely simple, and human hearts are never neat. She was a woman who was forced to compartmentalize, to separate the loving husband from the philanderer, the national hero from the personal source of pain. Her later years, after Onassis's death, offer the most telling chapter. She moved back to New York, not as a Kennedy or an Onassis, but as simply Jackie O. And she did something remarkable. She got a job. She became a book editor at Viking Press and later at Doubleday. It was a quiet, unassuming role for one of the most famous women in the world. She would ride her bicycle to work, her face hidden behind her signature large sunglasses. After a life lived on the world's biggest stage, a life defined by powerful men, she finally chose a life that was her own. She was no longer a first lady, a widow, or a tycoon's wife. She was a working woman finding purpose and satisfaction on her own terms. It was in this quiet third act that she seemed to find a measure of peace, reclaiming the identity that had been subsumed by fame, tragedy, and betrayal. The enduring power of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis lies not in the fairy tale, but in its demolition. She showed the world that grace is not the absence of pain, but the ability to function in spite of it. Her life holds a mirror up to our own fascination with celebrity and power, reminding us that the polished images we consume often hide stories of profound human struggle. We remember her for her style, her dignity, her quiet strength, but perhaps we should also remember her for the silent screams behind the serene smiles, for the iron will it took to stand by a man who repeatedly broke her heart, and for the resilience it took to rebuild a life from the ashes of not one, but two great betrayals. The first was the slow private erosion of her marriage. The second was the sudden public theft of her husband. She survived them both. In the end, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was not a victim. Victims are defined by what was done to them. Jackie, in every critical moment of her life, took the narrative back. She endured the infidelity and defined the role of the modern First Lady. She witnessed the assassination and defined the legacy of a fallen president. She fled the country that had taken so much from her, and in her final years quietly defined herself. She was the First Lady who had to smile through betrayal, but her lasting legacy is the quiet, steely determination of a woman who simply refused to be erased. Her story is a timeless, aching reminder that the most beautiful surfaces can hide the deepest fractures, and that true strength isn't about never falling, but about how you choose to stand back up. That's a wrap for today's video. If you enjoyed it, smash that like button, drop us a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss our new content. Thanks for watching.